work with people across the museum to kind of, hothouse ideas and evolve thinking, and and there were many people who were up for it, who were into it, and then quite a few people in the museum who felt a bit sort of threatened because they thought it might represent, change in the budgets, and so I had to do a lot of groundwork to sort of, build relationships across the museum. And for me, it was an opportunity to sort of, in the wider sense of the arts museum sector, of diversifying that, so I was going back to those feelings that I had when I first worked at the V&A. This is 15 years later or whatever it was, or 10 years later. And, how do you change the makeup of people who work in museums so that there's more representative of, life, and how do you engage, make what the museum, the stories that museum shows and tells and what it collects represent a broader section of society as well. So these were some of the sort of, goals and aims of the project. But it was a wild ride because I think 2 years in, almost immediately, the DCMS decided, so this is 2015, so let's say in early 2016, V&A was informed that it needed to vacate the building where it kept a large portion of its 3D collections in West Kensington. So suddenly the museum was like making a new museum, and then had to also deal with the conundrum of where it was going to move the 350,000 objects that it needed access to on a daily basis. And I think by 2017, the project that we were developing for the Olympic Park had to be remaster planned. And so I went from basically doing one building to two buildings, and completely reconceiving what V&A East was as a consequence of these kind of the morphing kind of landscape of politics and economics and practical need and so on. Mm-hmm. So it's ended up as V&A East Storehouse, which opened last year, V&A East Museum, which is opening in April this year. So my team and I, which I'd started to sort of gently, slowly build out, wrote the curatorial briefs for those buildings, developed
the two separate buildings.
Yeah. But interconnected and connected through their sort of values and programming and their curatorial agendas. So it's super exciting to see it all come to fruition with, from the very first ideas where we were just trying to sort of, articulate and sketch out what it could be, to being a built experience and a live place.
And so the storehouse became pretty much a unique thing, right? That sort of through circumstance, like you said, having to find somewhere to keep 35,000.
Well, this is where the museum was quite brave in that sense. It said, it did a lot of all the due diligence of, where can we put it, how much is it going to cost, what's the benefit, what's the need, and decided quite quickly not to just kind of take that portion of the collection and move it into a kind of, fairly low cost, semi-rural location, and decided that, proximity to the working body of the museum in London was paramount, but that also critically that public access was paramount, and how could it go from, a store that didn't really give people very much access on a year-on-year basis to being all about public access and engagement and going behind the scenes. So
where did that idea come from?
It sort of evolved over the years. Starting with this problem of what do we do, and I think V&A East, even though it wasn't initially part of that sort of project of moving the collection, definitely was one of the major sort of catalysts of rethinking the museum for the 21st century, thinking about access, thinking about how and whose story is told, who's telling it, how to engage people in these collections that are publicly theirs. So there's been a lot of these sorts of ideas evolving across the museum body within the team that I was sitting in.
Yeah.
And I think that also came together so that meant the leadership could really get behind that and have the faith and have the confidence, I suppose, to say, this could be a new typology of museum experience, and we all collectively believe that it would be really popular and inspiring and interesting and engage particularly younger audiences in a way that maybe sometimes more traditional conventional museum experiences don't hold people's attention in the same way.
So much people don't realise, right? As art professionals, we understand the ins and outs of exhibition making and everything that's involved. But when you did that tour for us for the club DKUK, it really struck me that most of the people that go to museums do not know what a crate looks like, or the care and attention that goes into the storage of these work and the skill of it all, right? And so for me, it really opened up the whole process of sharing art, and I've always been interested in hiding nothing, and the fact that you can see the supports and the struts and people working on restoration and whatever is the whole artwork, becoming much more a part of everyday life. Which is,
the museum is a working place.
Yeah, and I was talking to a client here the other day who'd been on my recommendation.
Oh, right.
Been telling everybody to go and have a look.
Ooh.
And they couldn't believe how slow it all was. The technicians, they were just moving so slow.
Yeah,
well,
but it's like moving a precious pot in your own home.
Exactly.
You take care. You don't want it to smash.
Yeah.
And the modern and contemporary art the media is so wide ranging. But also, if you've got it demands a lot of different skills to be able to, know how to handle something sensitively and carefully. But also, the surface of an old painting is also, vulnerable. And then in collections like the V&A, you've got everything from, ceramic fragments to, ancient textiles and fashion and metalware.
And I just love how
painting, prints, drawings, photographs.
Much of a jumble it was as well, in the best possible way. Like a real sort of cacophony of culture.
Yeah, I think we decided pretty early on to lean into that kind of the eclecticism of the collection, and any collection is just an assemblage of things that changes over time as different specialists and experts acquire things and shift the curatorial kind of focus. So it's really, it's been a collection that's been around for quite some time, and it's grown and morphed and changed according to those shifts in visual and material culture. So because it's art, design, craft, it's quite representative. In many ways, it's really diverse. So it's not, it's a long-winded way of saying it's not just painting.
Yeah.
For example.
is the Bowie archive, right? And all those clothes.
Yes, yeah. There's also, you know, as well as the collection, there is a collection of archives of companies, archives of people. So the David Bowie archive was one of the last things that I worked on before I moved on to another position. And he had wanted his collection to go to the V&A because it's the National Theatre and Performance Collection, but also I think, you know, he was so interested in lots of different cultural art forms that I think what was really special about acquiring his archive was that it could be brought into dialogue with, you know, artifacts from the Japanese collection about, you know, theatre and performance, or so on and so forth.
Him being such a chameleon and taking it from
exactly.
Sources.
And I think that's one of the brilliant things about the V&A's collection, is that you can have this sort of wide-ranging dialogues as part of the sort of creative process. You know, other collections, other archives, you know, there are other performers. PJ Harvey's given a lot of material from her personal collection in recent years. Designers like Kenneth Grange and you know, but also 19th century specialist sort of metalware producers like Elkington and stuff. So there's a real kind of huge resource in that sense, and that's partly was the motivation as well. It's like how can the collection be not just something you go and kind of look at and read about, but how, like, many companies and individual designers and makers come to the V&A for inspiration, and that sort of source book nature of the collection was also something that was important to the storehouse vision. You know, how
and people don't need special access for that, if I understand correctly. Anyone
yeah, I mean
can
that's
go and
that's the other
request stuff.
Been the other kind of brilliant opportunity is like how, yes, anybody can request stuff because it's a public collection. You don't need to sort of, you know, have a sort of stated highly specific research purpose.
Which I think is the case to go to the Tate Library or the British Library or many other like archives.
Yeah, I guess because it's, you know, yeah, exactly.